Hi, my name is Dan and I'm one of the DT evangelists here at Digital Tutors. In this video, we're going to look at a question from one of our users on how to get a Playblast to match our render output. Okay, so to illustrate this, I have a character from the Animating Game Characters course. And if I scrub through, you can see we have our animation here. And if you notice, I actually have my resolution gate turned on, which is accessible here. And we can see that right now I'm rendering out a basically 1080p, which is 1920 by 1080 full HD quality. Okay, so if I were to do a Playblast of this, let's right click and open up the options here. And if we can see, I've gone ahead and told it to save to a file. Let's go ahead and just see how this will Playblast out without changing any of these settings. You can see it's going through. And once it's done Playblast, it'll play this back for us. Okay, now as we can see, the actual resolution for this file is 487 by 261. So it's definitely not the full 1920 by 1080 that we have in our render settings. So how can we fix this so that it is the full 1080p? Okay, well, I'm going to close out of FCheck. Let's right click on our play window here and come back into our Playblast options. Now, the first thing we want to look at is our display size. Now, right now it's taking the display size from whatever our window size is. Okay, so I'm going to switch this to be from our render settings. That way, that'll force Maya to use the settings that we have here in our render settings, which as we see right now, I have set to the HD 1080 preset. Okay, now once that's set, there's actually another little option here for scale. Now right now by default it's set to be about half the scale from the display size. So it'll be half of our 1920 by 1080. Well, if we crank this all the way up to 1, then it'll be the full 1920 by 1080. Okay, now before I actually Playblast this, there's one last thing I'd like to do, and that would be to basically just come in and turn off my resolution gate. Because the way that Playblast works, basically it's going to come in and take screenshots of each frame. Okay, so with this set, we can go ahead and Playblast this. It's telling me that the images will be overwritten. That's okay. And right away, we can notice that there's a warning down here in our script editor. It's telling us that the Playblast cannot create movies larger than the active view. So basically, because this view here is not 1920 by 1080, it's not able to create the Playblast. So I could either size my Maya window up all the way in order to be able to see this. Notice when I get my results back, it's only 975 by 522. So even though we told it to match the 1080 resolution, it's not doing that. And the reason for that was because of that little warning that we got saying that our Maya window is not large enough in order to be able to basically take the screenshots that it needs to do for each frame. Well, if we have a large enough monitor, we can go ahead and size Maya up and to be able to have enough space here in our viewport. But what if we don't? Like for example, right now I can't size my window up anymore. So how can we get our HD 1080 quality out? Well, we can actually utilize the hardware render buffer. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can set that up. I'm going to come to Window, under my rendering editors, and open up the hardware render buffer. Okay, so this is basically the interface here. So the first thing I want to do is to come into Render, make sure that my scale buffer is set to 100%. So it'll show me in my hardware render buffer UI here, basically what is going to be, or the size that is going to be rendered out as. Okay, and then let's come back into Render and change our render attributes. Once we do that, we'll notice that we have our attribute editor here, so I'll move this window out of the way. I'm going to adjust the file name just to be something easy. We could do biker hardware render and change the file extension. I usually prefer to do like a name number extension, similar to in our render settings if we had it set to a name number extension. Very similar here in the hardware render globals. And we also want to come in and adjust our start and end frame. So in this particular case, I have starting at frame 1 and ending at frame 48. So I'll type in 48. I'm fine with the Maya IFF image format. And the next thing we want to adjust is the actual resolution. Okay, so just choose select, and I'll scroll down until I find the HD 1080. Go ahead, hit OK, and we can see what that's done in our hardware render buffer is that's gone ahead and sized up what our display is going to be. Okay, now you notice that we see all of our lights and all of our joints here in the hardware render buffer UI, but if we come over to our render modes, we can see that it's actually set to do smooth shading with texturing turned on. Okay, so if I come to render and just do a quick test render, we can see what it's going to look like when it renders this out. So we could leave texturing on, we could turn texturing off, do another test render, see what that looks like, all depending on what you may need. A wireframe, maybe flat shaded, sort of depends on what kind of look you're going for. Usually, if you're replacing a Playblast with this, it's probably just going to be a preview anyway, so I'll stick with my textured view here. Okay, so once I have things set the way I want, and come to render and render this sequence, and it'll go through and render out this sequence for us. Now it won't automatically just pop this up, so I'm going to hop over into Explorer here and find it under my images folder. This is the Playblast that we had, and then our hardware render buffer here. Let's open that up in FCheck. And right away we can see that once again it's very similar to our Playblast. It's only 962 by 542. So our hardware render buffer has not gone ahead and set it to a full HD 1080 resolution. So it's not. But one of the benefits of using the hardware render buffer, if I close out of this, is if we come over into our attributes for our hardware render buffer, we'll notice that we have an option for full image resolution. So what that's going to do is basically it's going to force the full image resolution. Now the way the hardware render buffer works is very similar to the way that Playblasting works, in that it's pretty much coming in here and taking screenshots. So very similar to the issue we had with our Playblast, we don't have the full size here. We can force Maya to use the full image resolution basically by putting together tiles of our scene here. Now, usually my personal preference when I do a hardware render buffer is to come in and actually turn on my alpha, because that way we'll be able to composite that however we may need to. And if we don't ever want to use it, then we don't have to use it. It all depends on what our final, what we're going to be using this for. Okay, so with those set, we can come in and re-render out our sequence. And notice right away it's going to look different because it's actually creating the tiles for this. I'll just let it go ahead and render out our sequence here. Okay, and it's all done, so we can close out of our hardware render buffer. Let's open up our images folder again, and I'll go ahead and double click on my first one here, and we can see right now it's set to 1920 by 1080. So if I open up my animation of my hardware render, go ahead and let it go through, we can see that we have our full animation here in 1080 HD. If I open up my, or turn on my alpha channel, we can see we have a nice clean alpha so that we can composite this into for whatever reason we may need. Okay, so those are just a couple techniques that we can utilize in order to get a full 1080p Playblast by either changing the settings in the Playblast options or by utilizing the hardware render buffer.